right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Disclosure. For one thing, I'm on the wrong screen. I'm not, you want to look up beside me like that. Good morning. How are you? Full disclosure, I live in the country. I'm living on a hotspot right now. I may end up turning my camera off so we can maintain bandwidth and I can stick with you. Welcome to CRPN Central, the podcast dedicating to bringing you the very best minds of our industry. We talk about our challenges, we explore them, and we find mutual solutions to get something done. Coming on stage is co-host Mitch Hilby. He might be host today. We'll see how the hotspot holds up. Mitch, how you doing today, my friend?
Phenomenal. Internet is working great.
Lucky. I'll tell you what, I love living out in the country, but I don't love the internet options. Come on, Starlink. Let's go.
Right.
All right, Mitch. This is kind of a blast from the past. We had this podcast last year at some point. Yeah. It's been a while. I think it was like episode 14 or it's been a while. What did you think of the podcast? What were your impressions of it?
Man, so, anybody who listened to it got this amazing taste of the philosophy that both of these individuals bring. And I love it. I'm always here for it. Also had the pleasure of seeing both of them speak together on stage at the SOS conference, and it got even better. I still think about Otap taking, his little relationship point on from Kierkegaard to Ariana Grande. And I couldn't be more excited about today. I love all the guests that are always on the podcast, but this one just has me like extra jazzed.
And honestly, I feel like SOS was one of those foxhole moments. Truly, it was pretty cool. Coming on to stage, Mr. David LaHaie, Dan Otap. Thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central Live. It's been a hot minute. We had this interview last fall. We talked at SOS, and here we are on a live debrief from what we've been literally living for so long. I have so many questions I want to talk to you about. Before we start, would you be willing to give brief introductions?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Sure. Well, thank you. So my name is David LaHaie. I am, I guess these are my words. These are yours, Daniel Fox, and and a handful of other people. They've described me as a serial entrepreneur, but I don't know. I just like building businesses and introducing like naive PIs into clinical research, and so I've done that a handful of times. And recently we started, or not, I guess not recently, but we started co-marketing the Great Lakes Research Network, which Great Lakes Research Institute is a site that I built in 2021 in Detroit, Michigan, and then we basically began co-marketing with a handful of other business owners, and so we've been utilizing the name of Great Lakes Research Network in order to further and expand the relationships within the pharma that the people that we work with and expand the breadth of what we do.
All right, Dan Otap.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me on this. Really quickly, I work for Genentech, and as a disclaimer, the thoughts and ideas and concepts that I speak today really represent my own. They do not represent Roche or Genentech in proper. So I am an alliance and partnerships lead within the early phase development portion of our company. I work predominantly in clinical trials, so I engage with our affiliate members of Roche Genentech across the globe. I also engage with sites, and I'm the director of a site network that's specifically focused on early phase oncology trials. And I have my hands in a couple of other networks that we're building out at Genentech. So some pretty exciting stuff. So super excited to be here. It's a good group, and I'm very lucky to be a part of it. So thanks for having me, Dr. Fox.
Oh my gosh. So Dan, David, I have to tell you, so I personally edit every single interview that I perform. I take away what I call the verbal viruses. It's the ums, the uhs, you knows, the time. So when you listen to the podcast, it's very produced, but I make it a point not to take out the content that's not on track. But I have to say, editing your podcasts, it's just totally inspirational. It's like a really good glass of wine, really good drink, because it's so philosophical. Both of you both of you on this podcast reference things that I say normal, many people do not reference: books, references, philosophy. I can't help but to think that as I listen to both of you, knowing that both of you are very, very good at relationships, if there's a lot of good content in philosophy that helps us to understand the human condition of relationships. I wonder if maybe that's part of maybe what we're talking about. Like I'd love to get into maybe a little bit of philosophy as we go through here, and maybe why you reference some of the things that you did in your interviews. But before we do, and thank you so much for the introductions, I wanted to ask just real briefly, let's start with David because yours was first. When you listen to this podcast and you listen to your interview versus that of Dan, granted, one is a site owner and one works at a sponsor in like site relations and a lot of the different initiatives. How did you feel about your interview versus Dan's?
That's a good question. So I think one thing that really comes out is, we're both humans and we're both put into, we're in slightly different roles, but we have we generally think about things in the same way. And this is the way most people are going to, think about their situation. And so to me, what that says is like empathy is exceptionally important in order to get something that you want. You need to be empathetic and provide something that somebody else wants, because Dan isn't just sitting around thinking like, oh, how can I help David LaHaie and his research sites do better? He's thinking, and I'm not knocking you out for not worrying about me more, right? But Dan is thinking he's got his own problems and he's got his own challenges, and he probably uses the same type of mental maxims and processing as I would in order to solve his problem. So from somebody who's empathetic, I've got to think like Dan, what are your challenges and how can I help you meet those challenges?
Mm-hmm. And so, Dan, what about you? When you listened to the interviews and you did a comparison, how did you feel?
So two things. One, I cringe every time I hear my voice because I was told a long time ago that I sound like a guy from Third Rock from the Sun. I don't know who that is, but if you guys know it, please tell me. So one, I cringed, but two, I was honestly humbled because I think of myself as a unique individual, right? Like all of us have our own narratives and stories. And I'm thinking, I've carved my own path. I've done this, I've done that. And then I listened to David LaHaie talk and I'm like, okay, there's a lot more I can be doing. So he hit the nail on the head, Dave, when you mentioned what you could be doing for me. That puts the specific mindset that I like to carry forth, in the very least, in every interaction that I try, to my best of my ability, of putting the other person before me. Right? I think it was either Through Painted Deserts or Blue Like Jazz. I forget the name of the author, but he mentioned this concept and I heard him speak, and I'll look it up and I'll send you the link. He said a phrase about you are more important than me. And that, as long as I keep that in my mindset and what I do and carry that forward, usually things fall into place. So what that means to me is, yes, I am looking for business partnerships and site engagement in a mutually beneficial way. But I was, looking at it from a personal perspective, it's really comes down to ultimately trying to put the other person before yourself, which is not always easy and simple. Not, at least for me, I don't naturally want to do that. Naturally, I want to kind of stay inside and internalize and actually be like risk averse. But when it comes to these kind of interactions and what's made our industry, at least our jobs, enjoyable, is things like what we're doing this morning, meeting people like Mitchell Hilby in Tucson and knowing from across the room that was Mitch and saying, I've seen him, let me go introduce myself, as he was building friendship or kindness or whatever. But it's that type of energy, that type of mindset, if you will, or framework of where David mentioned empathy. I resonated with that a lot. Not also
And I have
factor.
So I have a question, and empathy is huge. Empathy is critical for relationships. Putting yourself in that other person's shoes. I think Dan to Otap said it himself. We are here to make sick people feel better. And he used both the terms Herculean and Sisyphusian at the same time, which I thought was amazing.
I don't know about that.
Here's my question. So empathy, right? Obviously, it's easier said than done. If empathy is critical to solid relationships and good business, what would be the enemy of empathy?
Apathy.
Solipsistic. Sorry, you just said some big words, and I figure I try.
Solipsistic. Okay, so
I think that means selfishness.
Selfishness.
Yeah, you can look it up though. It's been a long time. Put that in writing anywhere. But I think that like I have a list of things that I need to do today. None of it is like do this for some other person, but you need to like but generally, like when we're talking about relationships, they're like a longer term investment. And so you can't be like, okay, well, I'm going to call and talk to somebody and say, hey, I want this and this and this. What can you do? Like, you have to work on phrasing things in a way that is not, that isn't selfish or self-serving, right? Like what is, Dan, like, what are you working on right now? Where are the challenges that you currently have? So look at it from a standpoint of you're looking at somebody else's to-do list, not your own. And then seeing where there's some shared synergies in place. So looking for that win-win situation rather than, I got to look this up. I'm pretty sure that rather than being solipsistic and focusing on your own to-do list, that is the enemy of empathy.
Yeah. So what do you think, Dan?
So at the risk of sounding like a false intellectual, I'm going to reference another book. So Ryan Holiday has a book called Ego is the Enemy. And it is a simple phrase, and the entire book is summed up in its damn title, but super small, and I love it. And it harmonizes with what David just mentioned in a word that I've never heard in my life. So thank you. I will be Googling that.
I looked it up, by the way. I was actually correct.
But as soon as let's talk about site and sponsor relationships. As soon as you start putting in this construct of self-preservation and self-importance and self-prioritization, you lose any type of concept where it's mutually beneficial. You're looking at, okay, what does Dr. Fox have that I need, that I want, that I can get? I have been in meetings where those types of interactions have happened. And let's also be true here. We're also looking at drug development. So now that I'm on the sponsor side, I do see that there are certain times where decisions need to be made ultimately by potential return on investment. So, there's nuances there. I'm not going to shy away from those. But if empathy is the critical kind of action to make these types of relationships and all this alliance work and all these contracts and MTAs that you have with sites or whatnot, if that makes it work, what makes it fall apart and crumble without question very quickly is putting your priority needs of your own before the others, and really self-centeredness. Really, we've heard a term that's way more eloquent than that. But as soon as the one counterpart in that relationship starts looking at what's in this for me, which you do anyway, right? You're going to do that as a site. You're going to do that as a company. Like, we're not going to enter into these kind of partnerships if we don't know that there's going to be mutual beneficial action. However, if I'm more focused on mine outweighing the other, then it's going to fall. So it needs to be bi-directional in nature, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I wonder. No, go ahead, Mitch. Go ahead.
You absolutely are spot on. I mean, you have to build some semblance of a win-win scenario for both parties. That transparency, mutual respect, understanding and accepting each other's. I mean, it's very similar to an actual relationship. I don't view business relationships any differently than, like a romantic one. accepting imperfections, whatever it may be. You have to have that communication and empathy for one another.
Yeah.
So I run into, and I try to do that. Empathy is trying to put myself in that other person's shoes, understanding their needs and their wants, and trying to cater to those, trying to help them, using the term servant leader, being there. For me, there's a switch that's flipped when I don't feel any form of reciprocity. In other words, I'm being empathetic and I'm feeling used. I feel like they are taking advantage of that empathy to get what they want without contributing to the relationship. So I wonder, from a site side, I just got off of a negotiation. Anything you want, let me know what you need. We'll do this. And they took advantage of it. They, fine, we'll just give you this terrible contract. We'll just give you this terrible budget. We'll use you because we know that you're a pushover. So maybe that sense of empathy and servanthood is considered maybe a weakness by some people when it comes to business.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh, I was just going to point out everything has to be taken into consideration, the time horizon of that relationship, right? When you're talking about somebody who's negotiating a contract, like when it's on the sponsor side, they have, and this is me talking, this isn't, the greater organization I'm affiliated with, but generally they are looking at it like it's a short-term transactional deal. And their thought process is to get you to accept as little as possible, and then they wash their hands of that entire project. It doesn't matter if you later realize that you will lose money doing that study, so you just stop performing it, and then, which none of my sites would do something like that, but it doesn't matter to them that many of their sites would do that, and they would stop running that trial, which would cause like some significant issues with recruiting the patients that are necessary for that study down the road. Like, they just see it as an individual transaction, not looking at it as far as something more of a win-win. But even when like from the site side and from where Dan's working at, you're working with sites directly and you're trying to find the best sites for Roche Genentech so that you regularly have reliable PIs and staffing that can execute your trials. Like, you're not looking for one transaction, like a one and done.
Yeah.
You're looking for a long-term relationship. And when you factor in that time horizon and you look long-term, like, this is not about this one project. This is about the next 5 years. This is about the next 10 years. This is about me getting my next promotion. All of a sudden, everything changes. You're not worried about getting something out of this person that they normally wouldn't say yes to. It isn't a zero-sum game. It isn't a matter of what's that term? Anyway, it's gonna come to me. I'm trying to throw out some really heady topics here, philosophical topics. Game theory. That's what I was. It isn't game theory where you try to go as low as possible to to get somebody to not be offended but accept defeat, essentially. And so I think those are all really key, but you do have to keep in mind there are a lot of there's entire departments that still look at it as like it's a in more of a game theory mode than anything else, and so from the business development standpoint, Dan, from your standpoint, like we can't really treat these interactions as though they're these one and done transactions.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, Dr. Fox, about feeling, like negotiations are a little bit more heavily sided one way. I still, guys, I'm 3+ years into the industry side, and I still, if you cut me, I feel like I still bleed site colors, right? And so I've seen it on both sides. I've been involved in the negotiations for site contracts. I've been involved in negotiations for master trial agreements. The biggest thing that I see sometimes is there is a vast chasm of knowledge, awareness, and then also drivers that are happening all at once and in different directions at different points in time, and having the ability of corralling that chaos is something that's a bit difficult at times. And why I say this is you have site alliance managers, and then you have budget analysts, and the budget analysts are looking at it from an FMV grant plan perspective, and they're given criteria, and that's it. And then I'm talking with David saying, I want to work with you for 5+ years. Where can we find where can we find wiggle room here? And sometimes it doesn't translate to, and I'm by no means pointing I'm not even, it just, different drivers are happening.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing for me in that is during the course of discussion, which is crazy. Actually, let me be frank, guys. The fact that we're still struggling with getting budgets approved, feel like it's an old topic. I'm not saying that it's clearly a pertinent topic, right? But what I'm saying by old is it's like I want to cuss and scream out the window and be like, come on. There's this concept of working in an industry that, one, deals with inflation. Guess what? We all deal with inflation. Figure it out, folks. It deals with like cost of living going up each year. So if you have a 5-year contract, how are we applying that or addressing that? Different changes happen. Like some of these things, to me, being a simple-minded person, seem very straightforward. Very straightforward. Like just provide the justification, agree to it, and move on. But it becomes very difficult. Like I think that somebody, I think you've had a couple people on your podcast to talk about FMV, but FMV is a whole different thing for me that I even struggle with, where I'm looking at these examples where one industry, for better or worse, uses one or two particular type of systems to get a generalized benchmark. And it may or may not jive with that site's cost model. And as long as that site has the justification to produce the cost, then it gets very complicated for me very quickly. But to finish my point, which I did not really effectively make, I think it's a matter of having boundaries and having your justifications for your costs, and then basically holding firm and saying, and I understand that it's a different thing for me to be saying this from the sponsor or coming from, Columbia University or Memorial Sloan Kettering and saying, hold firm. Like I get it. There's a nuance there that I'm also taking for granted. However, I still think it holds true at the end of the day, there's no such thing as a free meal. We also all want very good working wages for our staff and our employees. They basically want to take care of you guys are business owners, so you want to take care of the people that you have. I can tell, you can sense it, right? So that all comes down to the almighty dollar. And that's a hard one to grapple with. But have your justifications and hold firm. And then also don't be afraid of communicating to other, site leads to see if there's any learnings or best practices, or go to something like a conference like SOS or SCRS or something like that and connect with people. Clearly I could talk all day about this because I'm pretty passionate about it and I only have a surface level understanding of it. But man, if I retire, when I retire, I hope FMV is solved. Let's do that.
Well, I know. I was going to say CRPN's on its way, Dan. Just wait. I did want to say, and this sparked something. And I have a question for you. It's something I didn't get to ask on the interviews. But okay, for example, I don't know if you're sitting down, but I'm on version 12 of a contract negotiation right now. Version 12. So I know you can cuss, but here's my question, and I've seen this in a lot of very experienced business owners. When do you have an understanding of the relationship that you have with someone that you're working with? At what point does your litmus test come back and you're like, okay, I know where this relationship is going? When do you know?
Is this for me or is this for both of us?
Either way. So prime example, if I'm negotiating and they give the first offer and it's just junk because it's always junk, and then I give a crazy highball offer, and then we all kind of see where we're at. And then I give them the giant dissertation of everything spelled out, all the different justifications. So I've done everything I'm supposed to do as a site. And they come back and they say, oh, that's interesting. Let's talk about this. Versus, nope, tough crap. Rejected, 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 rejected. I don't care what you tell us about it. The sponsor's not offering this or whatever. We're just not listening, period.
Yeah.
That's my litmus test. I know who I'm working with right there. Someone who actually listens to me and wants to have a conversation versus someone who's a paper pusher who has a bell curve and they're not going to go out of this box.
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts on this actually. So Dan, you brought up Memorial Sloan Kettering, Columbia University. So those are places that have options, and so they can just hold firm and and if they don't get a study, then it's no sweat off their back, right? So for most sites, that doesn't actually translate into the current business situation for that site. I mean, I do know somebody actually. I had a conversation about a week ago with somebody, and this is a top 5 pharma company that he's talking about, but he has options, and he's like, I am not going to do any more studies from this pharma company because of basically like the contracts not being basically them sitting on the contracts and then like a year later just canceling the trial without giving any any notice to him. So he's just decided, I'm not going to work with this sponsor any longer. So it's nice if you can get that level of optionality, but most of us know that we don't have that. And so circling back to the whole situation with empathy and what you said about like, how do you know that you've kind of got that, like you realize who it is that you're dealing with. So with any type of like relationship that's a business to business, you're dealing with many different people, and in many cases, many siloed departments. And so, and this is more so on the sponsor side than it is on the site side, because generally you talk to me, you're not really too many degrees from like the actual research being done, right? I'm not going to see the patient, but I'm going to be like the person who does see the patient will report to me or report to somebody who reports to me. And so there's not all that much separation between us. Whereas if you're a site owner and you're dealing with a contracts and budgets person, like that person has nothing to do with the Dan Otap of that company. And so what's really important is to have have a certain amount of empathy, because especially early on within the relationship, like you've got to understand that there's that Dan Otap may really want to take his magic wand and make that problem go away, but you're also limited by what you can do. Yeah. And so the best thing that the site can possibly do in a situation like that is, I mean, in some sense, it's like you got to just either decide whether or not you reach the no-go threshold and do it. But if you hit that go threshold and you decide that you're going to take that study, it's really important, especially if it's a new sponsor, to just do everything you can to fulfill your quota and enrollment. And then if you can, just blow it out of the water. Just do 2x or 3x of that, because then that puts you into a different level where the study team knows who you are and is going to really is really going to nudge. I guess I could say nudge, because they're kind of part of a different silo, right? But at the same time, if you've got people within the budgets of contracts who are trained to treat everything like a transaction, and then you've got the study team who's gunning for you, and then you've got the site liaison who's gunning for you, that can put a little bit more pressure on different groups that are just kind of they're not bad people, they're following their their training and their instructions, so they're doing a very good job at what they're supposed to do. But but as everyone knows in business, it's like there's exceptions to every rule. And so the best way to become part of that exception is to make yourself so valuable. And this is why long-term time horizons are important. This is why empathy is important, because you don't want to damage any of the relationships with the site team, with the site liaison. And, you have to eventually treat them, or you have to treat them like they are your advocate. They may not be entirely just yet, but they will be, because you're going to show them that you're going to do such a good job for them. They're not going to be able to find anybody like you. And so when that's clear, then you've got advocates. And if you've got a study team advocate, and you've got a site liaison advocate, then you can kind of put a little bit more pressure within other parts of the organization, and hopefully get get your study materials quickly, get activated at a at a favorable position, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that is not something that you can get just right out of the gate first time around.
Yeah.
Like, that's something that requires a long-term time horizon. It's something that requires empathy with all of the individuals. It requires and it requires the it requires let's say it requires this constantly, I guess, following the plan, and understanding that not everybody that you're going to come in contact with represents everybody within that organization.
Yeah, but David, to your point, you're absolutely right in that, while they're siloed, those contract departments, those legal teams, they absolutely do collaborate with ClinDev and ClinOps. We meet, we have conversations. And if you're one of those sites where it's like, hey, look, I understand they're above what we've pre-approved, but we want them and we need them.
Yep. Yeah. Which that's why Memorial Sloan Kettering, I just have to imagine they get whatever they want. I mean, I've never been on that side, but
that's kind of like, you have that reputation behind you where people are like, yeah, we want that name on our trial.
Yeah.
And
I mean, decades of like hitting it out of the park every time, and the best researchers on earth.
So Dan, I remember a story from at the SOS panel, and this really resonated with me because it tells me that you have teeth. You talked about the process of actually maybe cutting off a relationship or telling a site no. They were literally like, you were bending over backwards to help them. You literally flew there on an emergency, and they kept asking for more. They kept holding a stance. They were just bullying you. And finally, you're just to the point where, okay, I guess, maybe this isn't going to work out. That's my question is, we talk about empathy. We talk about trying to develop and foster healthy relationships, but we have to acknowledge that not all relationships are healthy. So could you walk me through how do you discontinue cordially a relationship in business?
So it's a really good question. And I think a lot of the times if I ask this, I get soft answers, so I'm going to give you guys a pretty hard answer. I've only had to do this twice in my career. And how did I know it was time? It's when you have exhausted all efforts on your end. To your point, David, we never want to close a door or burn a proverbial bridge. You never want to do that, right? Because at the end of the day, back to my point that I said that I love that you remembered it, Dr. Fox, but at the end of the day, we're all ultimately trying to help sick people get better, right? So if I can't agree with you, that's fine. I can agree on one thing. Let's help sick people get better. So it reached a point where sometimes those decisions to dissolve an alliance, right? It's not dissolving an entire relationship. It doesn't mean that we won't potentially consider them for future trials or things. And then also things could change, right? So the future could be different. And then lo and behold, I have another conversation with you. The last thing I want to do is take a moment during a course where things aren't working right now for that relationship in a mutually beneficial way. That's another key that is hard to make sure that we outline. If it's not benefiting both parties, there's something in the mix of this that's wrong, right? So it was actually some external factors that influenced the overarching decision to dissolve a relationship. And that could be financial implication. It could be something like we just simply cannot align based on, it's almost like a house, like negotiating for a house, right? Like if the price is not what I'm looking for and the comps are X and you're still at this and the comps are like 25, 50, sometimes guys 200% below.
Yeah.
That's a stopgap and you can't do that, right? So for me, it is a long, hard decision to especially in the realm of alliance or in general in strong, we have strong site relationships with centers that we don't have in an alliance, right? But as far as moving away from the relationship, one, if it's not benefiting both parties, and what I mean by that is use OKRs or KPIs or something to track that, because otherwise, when you try to justify or explain what it is that you're doing with a site to build relationship, it's very difficult to explain to higher ups when they want to cut a check, right? So I'm like, okay, gotta have clear goals with this company on an alliance. And then being mindful of other departments, because to David's point and to Mitch's point, there are myriads of departments in these companies, and each has its unique driver. Yes, we have our overall goals, like company goals, etc. But like if you talk to one person that's doing budgets, their focus and what is top of their mind may be different if you talk to, a CTL, clinical trial lead, or somebody who's helping with activation. So being mindful of the external parties that are also beholden to that relationship and ensuring that they're in a mutually beneficial scenario as well. And sometimes it comes down to hard brass tacks where we're given by our leadership, certain parameters that we ultimately can't go out of, or if we do go out, we try to request deviation or approval, and it doesn't always happen. So mutual beneficial interaction is key and paramount. And then for me, if I'm getting some external drivers that are really just non-starters, finance is really one of the biggest ones, actually, guys, to be honest. I've had relationships with investigators that I think the world of, and I still think that they're fantastic doctors, fantastic investigators, have great staff, and we just couldn't agree financially, and that's it. And that is the only reason why. That is above, to turn a phrase, that's above my pay grade. I'll do what I can, but it's above my pay grade. So I don't know if I answered your question. Mutual benefit.
No, that's perfect.
And
the
when it
ability
comes
to acknowledge that.
certain brass tacks things, like if as a company, but the thing is, guys, I would tell you that.
Yes.
And that's something else.
Transparency. Yeah.
I would tell you, I would have a full and frank discussion, Dr. Fox, this is where we stand, and this is the reality. And you would know that I am not, you're not BSing anything, right?
This is,
So that's another aspect of boundaries in relationship, where you're creating a space where you're saying, I am providing you the most transparent information and justification. You provide me some transparent feedback. And if you're not getting that, and oh boys, if you're not getting it from the negotiator, etc., just make sure that you also, this is not a panacea for everything, but make sure that you have the sponsor in that discussion as well. Because there is a lot, and this is not a negative comment towards CROs. What I'm saying is CROs are also given their marching orders to execute their jobs, so that nobody walks in. I forget who said this phrase, but I loved it. Nobody walks in the door to their workplace at the beginning of the day, regardless of their whatever they are, a lawyer, a judge, clinical research. Nobody walks in thinking, man, I just want to suck today. I just want to be the worst. You want to do your best. So just giving the benefit of the doubt there, and knowing that these folks that are negotiating these budgets are probably given very strict parameters. And if you're waiting to hear back for 2 weeks, it's probably because they had to escalate to their boss, and then their boss, because it reached a certain parameter, had to escalate to their boss. Yep. What really matters in that process is not necessarily that you have to go through that process, but that we're communicating back to you as a site that process is ongoing, so that you're not just in a vacuum or a black box. So
that's the follow-up question that I had, because oftentimes you just get no news, right? When that happened.
It's a good, and forgive me for doing a lot of talking here, guys, even though it's a podcast. I guess it's what we're supposed to do. But David, to your point, let me give you an example of a different paradigm. So communication to me is very paramount in just knowing where things stand on both sides. So I have one site in particular that has 5+ new trials that we're working with them on, all hitting at once. FPIs ranging in bing bong, like, man, that made me sound like Trump. Pinging between like August, September, October, November, like just bam, 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 bam. So I'm thinking, okay, we're one sponsor. They're going to have like a strategy here to start these trials up. And they do. One of our studies is experiencing some nuances, and we're trying to know when the right time to communicate to the sites is. So I'm not advocating for not communicating, but what I do want to point out to us is, even though I may see that as just 2 weeks gone by and nobody's communicating with me, or guys, I'm sure some of you have had months, which is crazy to think about, but from waiting on a sponsor or CRO, but they too sometimes struggle, or we too sometimes struggle with, okay, especially in early phase, there's a lot of unknowns, GLP tox information coming in, like a lot of different things that we're just not sure of. Again, communication is most paramount, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also sometimes a thought process on the back of the envelope for the sponsor to figure out, okay, how can we communicate this in the most effective way without causing turmoil or confusion or frustration?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I've got a really cool example for that, Dan. And this happens all the time on the negotiator side, especially at a site. You're negotiating a trial. You have this banter with the negotiator. And then over here on the side is the clinical ops group saying, how's that contract? How's that negotiation? How's that doing?
Yeah.
Right? So as the site negotiator, you have a choice. You can either focus your energy on that negotiation and get the job done, or divert your energy and have all these little intermittent pieces of communication to the people asking you that are likely going to change within 5 minutes. So from that perspective, my guess, if I were to put myself in the sponsor's shoes and I said, okay, well, we can either give real-time updates that are going to be archaic by the time we send the send button to the sites, or we can focus on getting the job done, focus our resources, and only tell the sites when things have changed, when things are relevant for updates.
Mm-hmm.
That could be part of it. From my experience, those super duper long, month-long, how's it going? How's the trial? It was a result of the CROs changing staff members and not telling the sites about it.
That's interesting. I didn't think about that, but
it reminds me of something that I think a friend of my grandfather's had said. I overheard him say this when I was like a high schooler. He said, when I got married, I told my wife I loved her, and if anything changed, I would let her know. And so we went like 30 years without like saying I love you again. Sometimes like having, even if nothing happens, having like an update of a status update of no status, is definitely helpful for some people, especially if you can get in your own mind and wonder if there's something wrong with the study. Like,
I mean, David, it goes back to the fact that I'm aware that you're probably handling a lot more sponsors than just me. And you're handling a lot more studies than just my one that I'm offering you that I think is the best in the world and that you should take, right? Like, I get that. I don't know, Mitch, I don't know if you're aware of this, or maybe Dr. Fox. I don't know on average how many new studies non-academic medical centers activate throughout the course of the year. That would be an interesting, maybe it's captured somewhere. You guys know? I don't know.
Yeah, I've got some metrics.
Okay.
Your average 2 to 3 year old site, 1 to 2 indications, they activate between 18 and 24 trials per year.
Okay.
As you increase in indication and size of network, you're of course going to get higher. But your mom and pop community, target 18 to 24 to start.
Okay. So that's, if I'm hearing correctly, at least 2 new studies a month. And it doesn't happen like that ever, right, guys? You're probably activating 5 in 1 month or something like that. And then 1 month you're not active. Yeah. So I get it.
It's bursts.
So the reason I bring this up is the simple fact that and I hate to beat the same drum here, but David, if I'm interacting with you on my study, I should be keeping in mind that you are also handling a whole host of other activities, and I should try to make your life as easy as possible. I know that sounds super, I think I said kumbaya on our last podcast, so I'll say it again. Right. And there's boundaries, or there's balances, right? So clearly we can't everything within measure or good measure. But it goes back to the simple fact that even the notion of communicating and being transparent and knowing, like, if we know that certain sites are not going to be escalation sites and we're looking at them for more like an expansion effort, we should let them know that so that they're not worried about activating in the next 2 months. They're like, oh, okay, wait for expansion. That gives me 6 months. And it might change their dynamic of whether they want to participate in that study or not, right? So it's all about full transparency and continued communication. So I love that reference of I got married and told my wife I loved her, and I'll tell her, yeah, I don't know. That's some life lesson. I'm not really sure how that's gonna.
Yeah, I think it's important to know, like,
yeah, I think all of us are chuckling on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So if there's like 18 to 24 studies that are activated on average, not all, like from the site standpoint, not all studies are created equal. I know from the CTM and from the study staff, like that is their one thing at the moment. But from the site, it's a very different situation when you have a study that you anticipate maybe 1 or 2 patients being enrolled, that being delayed, and you don't hear anything back because it's not really a game changer of a study. But then there's also studies that are like you hire people and you intend to separate, like, or you intend to dedicate like half of your staff, sometimes even like 60% of your staff, specifically to one particular study. And what's odd is like, and this is this is like, you got to wear the other person's shoes to walk around in it, in some sense, when you're from the site and you're this one study is like a lower priority than everything else you're doing. Oftentimes you drop the ball on communicating to the sponsor of like where you are in the phase of startup. But then, on the other hand, there's also the sponsor where, many times there'll be the one study that, you screened or pre-screened 200 patients for this trial. You hired 2 new coordinators and trained them over the last couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden it's crickets. So there's plenty of ways that we can abuse each other in the whole situation. So, but like, as I think what's consensus here is, to be kind to one another, and to make sure that these relationships actually have some lasting power in the events that, they're in the events that sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes studies get canceled. Sometimes sites lose their capabilities in the middle and have to withdraw from studies. Like, the thing is that the relationship should live longer than any little minor event like that.
In the situation, yeah.
Yep.
It's funny. So every single podcast we have, and you two align the same way. It's, you always want to do the best you can to help the other person. We hear that from every single side of the line. I think where the fallout is really almost this like self-destructive process, right? We care. I think it's a Marcus Aurelius quote. We care more about our own well-being, but we care more about the opinions of others. And I think there's like this inherent fear that, we have. You don't want to send an email that just says, "Hey, I have nothing to tell you. I'm sorry." It makes you feel bad because you want to be able to solve a problem. You want to be able to help people, but sending an email that says, "I can't do anything for you," kind of sucks. But it just is destructive to that relationship process and that building.
Yeah.
I agree completely. And we've been on here for 49 minutes, so we've got about 10 minutes. I did want to see our comments. Thank you so much for tuning in, Velena. We're going back to justification. So Velena said, I couldn't agree more about detailed justifications on letterhead. I agree. The more clear you are to a sponsor, the better, as long as they listen. Honestly, I think sometimes those letters just go into a shred bin because they don't care what you have to say. They have parameters that they have to follow, and they're not even allowed to consider some of the things you have to say. She also said, I'm a huge advocate for sites to send justification in the first counter offer. Yeah. Again, back to the clarification, clear, transparent communication, but also reciprocity, consideration for that. It can't be a one-side deal. I get to the point where I just say, look, I've given you everything. I'm here to offer you services, but I'm not going to sing for my supper. One of the best and most polite ways that I maybe end a relationship is, I respect your resources. I want your resources to go to developing your technology. I don't feel like this is a good fit at the site. Maybe you would have a better opportunity to be successful at another site, and that's okay. And that has happened a lot, oftentimes with continuing reviews. That's my favorite example. If you've been at this trial for a year and it's just not working out, you don't have the patient populations they're looking for, it's not working, go to the sponsor and you say, hey, I noticed continuing review is in 3 months and maybe just this isn't going to work. I don't want to waste your money on another continuing review and another year of trying this if we are not benefiting from each other. So maybe let's just talk about maybe closing the site out and then letting you focus your resources on advancing your technology. And it's a very good and respectful way of saying, I want to preserve this relationship, but I don't know if it would be wise for our relationship if we continued this trial right here.
No, I think it's a beautiful way of doing it, right? And it's juxtaposed to the way in which I would look at, like we were saying, from a sponsor perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean like there's a difference between like a study level type relationship engagement that's very transactional, and then alliance. So dissolving or walking away, or however you want to say it, from an alliance. Again, you gave an example of how you're basically holding your ground. You have a boundary, and you've ultimately reached a point where you're making a decision saying this is not a good fit. It doesn't mean that other person is, less deserving or you don't want to interact with them in the future, but it's just not a right fit now, right? So maybe it'll change in the future. But to your point, if they come back with a similar thing for a new study, then it's going to be the quick answer saying,
yeah. And that's the other part.
Reciprocity is huge, and I like your call out of that. It is massive. I will say that there are a lot of good people working in this industry alongside of us, other companies, etc. So I think ensuring that justifications come back, I think that's actually helping the budget and finance analysts in a lot of ways. And I don't know about you guys, but if you have certain things like just structured costs that you're not going to change, getting those out ahead of time. I've seen where we had, how you guys get those welcome letters from sponsors saying, congratulations, you've won. It's basically like a surprise package, and here's all the reg docs, or maybe 3/4 of the reg docs that you really need to activate. But I digress. We had a return letter saying, thanks so much. We're super excited. This is what we need, right? In order to activate. And if you give us this, we could activate. And we have activated it at large AMCs less than 30 days. From the time we received the documents to the time we had an SIV. I was a regulatory director, and we were able to accomplish that. Is that the norm? Somebody mentioned bell curves. No. Yeah. However, it's feasible, right? And a lot of that had to do with relationship management. Mm-hmm. But it's just something that to make sure that we keep in mind when we're engaging these things. Like each study could be viewed as another opportunity. But then again, there's certain things that if you have your cost justification up front and you send it and it's just a hard no, then you know that it's probably not a good fit. Ultimately, you're not going to partner with that company. Yeah.
And if you try to make it fit, odds are you'll compromise the relationship.
Or you'll take a hit and you're going to be underwater. You don't want to be underwater on a trial, right? I don't know. I maybe this is a different podcast that you guys have already done, or maybe future, but the process that you as site owners and network leads, et cetera, do to assess whether a study is a viable option for your center, I'd be fascinated to learn more.
It's right? Different everywhere.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, Dan, and this is where it's a perpetuating relationship. If you agree to an underwater contract, I know. Guess what happens the next time they come and award you a trial? That's the expectation that you will be doing it for and so you just continually drowning in underfunded. It's very, very tricky.
You can't
establishing a low fair market value.
Well, yeah, and then you're hurting all the other sites too.
Yeah, and one of the big costs is procuring a patient as well, and that's not something that is line itemed out in any budget. And so you need to make up that cost somewhere else, and that cost is wildly different depending upon what study you're doing. It could be $10,000 for one study. It could be, $100 for another study. And so if you were to accept something that's very low and like a lower cost for, let's see, a lower cost where it's actually fairly easy for patient recruitment, then what happens when you get a study where it's a lot more difficult and a lot more costly to recruit those patients?
Yeah.
However, they expect every single line item to mirror the one that's easier to recruit for. So that becomes something of a challenge when you have to vocalize that. And I think that's that's one of these I guess budget idiosyncrasies in the industry where there are certain things you can't charge for, and so you have to make up for it in other items. And obviously the question then becomes, well, how come it costs you this much to do an EEG or or something else? And it's because it's the cost isn't in doing this procedure. The cost is in something else that doesn't have a value assigned to it on this spreadsheet.
And Dan, you were absolutely right. So it's varied across every site. Some sites just go there and kick the tires on the protocol and then guess on value, and others have it's all spelled out. They know everything about it.
I mean, there should be, if I was in those shoes, I'd be looking at going, okay, how many patients would I need to enroll in order to cover the cost for this to be open? Because if I can't get that, then I'm not going to open. And I mean, that's me being super simplistic, but that I just would be fascinated.
It's always what's your break even. They call it their break evens.
Yeah.
So how many patients do I need to enroll just to break even?
Yeah.
And realistically, you want it to be maybe between 25% of your enrollment is what you're targeting, but it all depends, because you've got and this is another podcast, and actually we're going to close down, but you've got all of these sunken costs that are not considered in the budget, and therefore they are forced to be taken out of the margins of the site, which means they're not even margins if you think about it. They're just unfunded mandates that you have to comp for. But you're right. That is a totally different podcast. I did want to end on relationships because that's what we're talking about today. But we've got about 2 minutes left. I'd love to just maybe pass it around. So after everything we've talked about today, and after everything that we heard in the podcast today, if I gave each of you the microphone and I said, what would you like to tell this industry about relationships, how we can navigate them, and how we can all work together to maybe make a better research, what would you tell them? David, you want to go first?
Sure. I think the biggest mistake people made, we unpacked it quite at length, is that if you're after a quick transaction, like, you're not thinking long term enough. Unless you're going to retire tomorrow, then you should plan on looking things more at 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan. And then if that's going to change the way that you communicate with people, you're going to be much more empathetic. You're going to be much more accepting of the limitations that the other people have. And then if you feel if you take ownership in what they entrust you with, and you do an excellent job for them, and then you'll get another study and another opportunity to work with them, and then it's just going to be it's going to be like a flywheel. You'll get more and more opportunity, more and more people want to work for or work with you, and then after a certain point, they'll be reaching out to you. You won't be begging them for more things. But that's something that's you can't just walk away and just do that with a little bit of information. It's like it takes a lot of elbow grease and a lot of work to make that a reality.
Well, and you have to build that trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about you, Dan?
I think in summary for me, if anybody who's listening to this, thanks for listening this long. For me, if you're doing the things that all of us have been talking about, and you truly are, trying to put people before you and trying to be mutually, focused on goals, and really just trying to bring the good into the conversation, trust the process, because it's going to be hard as hell to stay positive, because I'm sure those of you on this call have dealt with people where you're doing everything under your power to make it work, and they're just not working. And that's It's okay. That's okay. So trust the process, and trust that if you put one foot in front of the other, ultimately here, things will work out. Things will shape out. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish here, but honestly, as a foundational element here, if you know you're doing everything that you can in your power to be the best you can be and put those others before you, stuff will come out in the wash, right? I mean, all of us have been taught that over the course of years. So
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in it.
Well, and so I'll follow up to that. But Mitch, what would you like to do to wrap up?
Yeah.
To say?
So two quick points. My favorite takeaway from today is how you end a relationship in a healthy way, right? It can be healthy. Not every relationship is going to continually work. There might be pauses or stop gaps here and there. Don't just play thank you next and walk out the door. Make sure you do it in a healthy manner. And then my advice, to piggyback off of what everyone else is saying, is to take my personal Winnie the Pooh approach and make sure you're always there with a listening ear, helping hand, pot of honey, whatever it may be, to provide help and empathy.
Mm-hmm. And I like what Dan said, and I'll mix what Mitch and Dan said. Importantly, guys, if it was easy, everyone would do it, and we wouldn't have to have a podcast like this. Okay, not every relationship is going to be bells and whistles, golden honey. But then I go back to what Mitch said, and this is an old farmer's tale that I go by, and it simply says that if you give it all away, you will never be able to give it all away. And it only means that giving individual, when everything averages out, when you focus on long-term horizons with so many different people, you're going to have your losses. You're going to have rough times. You're going to have to know when to cut those, and you're going to have to know when you're not going to be used. And you're not a pushover by fostering good relationships. There's a difference. This isn't parasitic. It's very synergistic, and you have to focus on working with those same people that are synergistic. And so relationships are key. We know that. We also know that it's an art. And I think that we talked to some amazing artists in the relationship field today. So importantly, David, when you see this again, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today. We're a few minutes over. I really appreciate you sticking around, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.